Our final panel focuses on one of the most important subjects that ALPA continues to promote. From the safety perspective, it is so important to so many of us. Well-trained and fully qualified pilots in both seats of an airline aircraft are the best way to ensure the continued safety of our national airspace system. Captain Frank Cheeseman is joining us again. He is our chair of the Human Factors and Training Group, and he will lead a panel discussion about the issues surrounding pilot supply and the need to ensure that pilots are highly qualified and fully trained. Frank?
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you having us back and having me back today. First of all, I wanted to wish Todd Lisak, our training council chairman, good wishes. He had a family health issue, and that's why he's not here today, so I'm filling in for him. In addition to that, I just was reminded that we are standing between an on-time delivery from the FAA administrator, so there's no pressure on this team at all to be done on time. So, but we're looking forward to having Administrator Huerta here in just a few minutes. He's a great guy. Well, you've all heard about it. You've all heard about the issues of pilot supply, where we're getting our pilots from, what their certification standards and processes are going to look like. And we've heard it from the certificate holders. We've heard it from the regulators. We have two of those on stage today that I'll introduce. And we've heard it from the Airline Pilots Association and what our position is on that. And so we're going to continue our discussion of that today. And so our panel is an excellent panel, a variety of people that will be able to give you some insight into all of these areas. So first, we have Captain Paul Ryder, the Airline Pilots Association. Good. Wow. Paul. He is cute. They say he's cute. I don't know. Anyway, we'll leave that alone. And then we have Captain Mike McCasky, Managing Director of Flight Training at United Airlines and A4A Training Chairman. Thanks, Mike, for coming. Captain Dave McKenney from the Airline Pilots Association. He works with me in Human Factors. Today he's going to be talking about pilot training. And we also have Pierre Ruel from Transport Canada. And we have a unique connection and spin, not necessarily spin, but connection to the pilot supply and some of the things that are going on up in Canada with the UAS certification and how that'll affect our pilot supply. So first, Paul, you're going to be going over some interesting stuff for us. What do you got for us?
Thanks, Frank. So the discussion of pilot supply has been out front and center for most of this industry right now. And what I want to do is start off at a 30,000-foot level for you and give a global picture, and then we're going to zero in on the U.S. and talk about what's really been important here today. So on the first slide here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Boeing's projection for the entire world. And it's broken down by region. You can see it's 617,000 pilots projected over 20 years. This projection comes out every year, and it's adjusted. There's several others, but this one's the most optimistic. It has the highest demand, and so that's why I want to start off with that. What you can see is that there are regions in the world that have a significant need for pilots. What's important to acknowledge is that every region is unique, both in its opportunities and its challenges. And what works and will help one region may not translate directly to another region. So if someone were to talk about the Asia-Pacific region and a pilot shortage, absolutely. That's a valid discussion. There has to be a set of circumstances that are brought forth in that region to address that issue. And they're doing their best, and that's one discussion. But in the US, let's look at something different. Let's look at what we're producing and what our demand is. Because is our situation, is our circumstance here a pilot shortage? Right now, what you can see is the data that we've gathered from the FAA in terms of pilot certification for the ATP and restricted ATP. The FOQ rules created a new certification pathway for the restricted ATP. That means that you didn't need 1,500 hours, but if you had better training, You could offset some of the aeronautical experience requirements with academic and better flight training to receive a restricted ATP to be able to serve as a first officer at a 121 carrier. Right after the rulemaking in 2013, we had just over 2,700 pilots certified with an ATP. The next year, the restricted ATP came onto the market, and we started to see that grow. And year over year, we've seen that restricted ATP certificate continue to grow, and that's a good sign. Over 3.5 years, 26,000 certificates were issued that are ATP or restricted ATP. And why don't I reference private or commercial? Because they're not relevant to flying as a Part 121 pilot. So how does this factor into demand? Because that's really what we're trying to find out is there a shortage based on current production versus projected demand? So what we can see here is that fan at the bottom of that chart is all of the projections from the most reputable sources and recognized sources for pilot projection and demand figures. On the top, you've got Boeing. On the lower end, you've got the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and everybody else falls in between. That range fan goes from about 5,800 pilots a year on the high end to about 1,900 pilots on the low end. Under today's current market and what we're producing, you can see the forecasted demand moving out forward without any change. Under the current regulatory structure, we're exceeding demand. But let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. If we look at that same range fan in the orange there at the bottom, what we can see is that there isn't consensus from everybody on what the demand is. But if we accept the highest, the most optimistic demand, and we look at current production on the high band of the red identified forecast is a 20-year look back of the average. So if we look back 20 years, what we've been producing for ATP certificates, that top band is the high production value. On the low end is if we include all of the recessionary periods. So we know that our industry is cyclical. So there's years of high production and years of low production. Even if we account for the low production, which is about 5,950 pilots. That's during the recessions. That's when we were going through 2 recessions, post 9/11, age 65. There wasn't a high demand for pilots. We were still exceeding the current forecasted demand. So what does that mean? Do we just hang it up and say, we don't have a shortage today, so we're okay? No, what we have to do as an industry is we have to challenge ourselves to how to minimize the threat of the cyclical nature of our industry returning and causing us to be off kilter, be on our heels when an opportunity presents itself. We know we have to compete with carriers from around the world. We know that we have carriers that are going to continue to grow, and we have to meet that growth and the demand for pilots that creates. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have pathways and we have a system that can accommodate the demand moving forward. The current regulatory structure formalized 3 new pathways, and there's 4 overall career tracks. And what you can see here on this chart is that a military pilot who completes their obligation to the military will be able to receive a restricted ATP certificate at 750 hours. That credits half of the amount needed for the ATP. If they go through an accredited 4-year institution with an aviation degree, they'll be able to get a third of the hours credited, and they'll have a 1,000-hour requirement. A 2-year program is 1,250, and if they go through any other program and can get their training and their education separately, they can go and receive a full unrestricted, but at 1,500 hours. So what this does is it places value on the quality of the training and instruction received by the student as they become a professional pilot, rather than just looking at hours alone. But what's important for us to address as an industry are the factors that have been limiting the supply of pilots to some of our carriers. What I characterize that as is a candidate shortage. And we've looked at this for the last several years, and we've identified 3 generally simple areas that need improvement or need to be present for us to be able to recruit and retain pilots. Fair compensation, good work-life balance, and career progression. Now, we've seen recently several carriers have really taken strides in improving the compensation, but we can still work together to find a way to make that sustainable. That's one of the things we have to now work towards and work together to make sure we take sustainable approaches to our changes. A bonus is great, but it goes away. So if we make that sustainable, we roll it into the wages, and now someone who is going through a 4-year program knows that at the end of that 4-year program, that's what the wage will be instead of a bonus program, which will be gone in about 2 years. The next thing is the career progression, and we've seen several carriers work to improve the connection from training to their first job, to their building of experience and becoming a professional airline pilot, to the career that they've entered the profession to be a part of. The lower the risk is for the candidate, the more attractive it is to this next generation of pilot. So today isn't about me giving you the answers or saying who's right or wrong. It's about provoking some thought in what we can do to partner together as an industry to identify the key characteristics, both economic and in many cases, the non-economic partnerships that can create a sustainable path for our pilots, that can attract the next generation of pilot to allow us to seek out, identify, recruit, and retain the best and brightest moving forward.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. I have 2 questions for you. One quick one maybe a little longer. First one, are we seeing any return of North American pilots from overseas back to North American operations as the economic conditions have changed in North America? And what impact do you think you'll see overseas as a result of that?
Sure. One of the incredible things about the U.S. Pilot supply market and our ability to train is that we train not only enough pilots for the U.S. but for around the world.
Okay.
And during the downturn, some of our pilots did need to look for employment where
Sure.
they could find it, and they went overseas. But
Absolutely.
we are seeing, to answer your question, we are seeing pilots return from the Middle East, come back and seek employment with U.S. carriers because this is where they want to fly and this is where they hope to fly, and those opportunities are now coming back. It's a great time to be a pilot in the United States.
In the United States, but that's certainly going to affect their supply around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a tough situation for them. Second question, just as I mentioned yesterday, just sent my son off to college, and I'll tell you, there's some kitchen table talk going around in some homes in North America and around the world. We talk about young people that go to their parents and say, I'd like to be an airline pilot. And parents say, well, what's that going to cost and what's the return on investment? Do you hear that conversation at all when you're out visiting universities?
Absolutely, and we hear that from our new entry pilots in talks with them about what it was like to pick this profession. Our education committee goes out and promotes the profession and encourages students to continue down the path and provide the motivation necessary to stick with the hard work to becoming an airline pilot. And we do hear that. It's not just for being an airline pilot. We know that any student looking at an education
Sure.
sits at the table with their parents, and the return on investment has to be sound. And it's, again, not just about the economics of it, it's all about them wanting a career. And the lower the risk is for them entering in, the more we can create a defined path and show them and mentor them and provide them with the information necessary to make well-educated decisions, the better off we're going to be in our recruitment efforts, and
Sure.
the better it will be for the parents. But it is very important for parents to see that return on investment.
Absolutely, particularly with the significant cost of secondary education in our country, which is, and in North America, which is a whole nother subject we could get into. Thanks, Paul. It's great. Next, we have Captain Mike McCasky from United Airlines. Mike, I understand United's looking at some innovative programs and partnerships with universities, a lot of interesting and new ways that you're going to look at recruiting the best pilots at United. Can you give us a little insight of what's going on there?
Sure.
And what your folks are planning and looking at?
Sure, Frank. Thank you.
Sure.
So at United, we've taken the tack very similar to what Paul has described, around defining the path to United Airlines. And so as a network carrier, we understand we have a huge reliance on our express partners. So as a result of that, we've entered into what we call career path programs that define a path from the partner to United upon reaching certain requirements, time and service at the partner. They go through the application process at United Airlines, and once they reach the commitments necessary as defined in the agreement, then they come to United Airlines in a class seniority order. We have 3 of those in place right now. And we're also working through a proof of concept career path program with a flight training school down in Arizona, which we will start to see those first candidates come to us here later this year. And that's more of what I would call a direct entry to us. Our requirements are unrestricted ATP at United Airlines. And so that's the pinnacle that the crews and the pilots have to meet when they get here. Additionally, as a result of that, we've extended into some discussions with university programs.
Sure.
We have 4 or 5 of those underway right now, discussions. Nothing's been formalized. Same concept, that they would provide a service to the university for a period of time and then naturally flow to our express partner to support them and transition to United Airlines, with the goal of, to Paul's point, creating that defined path with some expectation down the road, but specifically not a guarantee, which has been a bit troubling in some circles. But for right now, we're very happy with where we're at, but understand that the industry has got some challenges ahead of them. So we want to entice people to come to United sooner and define that path all the way.
Do you interface with, for lack of a better word, your competitors? Do you know what Delta's doing, or do you partner just with your, not necessarily partnering, but are other managing directors in the industry, other personnel folks looking at best practices? How are you getting your pilots at Delta and United and Express? Are you sharing those experiences?
We do share some information.
Realizing you're competing for the same guy.
Exactly.
And gal.
Well, that's always the challenge.
Right.
Is to provide a value proposition to come to United.
Sure.
No disrespect to Delta and American, but we'd prefer that they come to United.
Right.
But is to share those best practices around recruiting. Obviously, there's a significant investment that we make in recruiting and retention, and so we want to maximize the value of that while attracting the best candidates to the airline.
How do you approach let's say you wanted to develop a relationship with a university. How does that happen, Mike? Do you send a team on the road? Do you go out to dinner with aviation directors at universities? How do you build that relationship?
Well, we have extended our reach into the 2 major groups with the universities, Abbey and UAA, and so we have an active participation in both of those organizations, and so we'll conduct outreach there and then formalize discussions with the schools, either the deans or the professors in charge of that particular issue or item.
Had a pilot ask me, with the cost of this, maybe it would be a good, or mention to me, maybe it would be a good idea to incentivize some young people. Are companies like United looking at scholarships for young people at all, or is that something maybe you're considering in the future?
So we have looked at, we have considered scholarships and some tuition assistance and reimbursement. We're not there yet.
You're not there yet. It's complicated.
It is a complicated equation, and frankly, it's I think at some point the discussions will become more athletic, as I like to say, in the future, but nothing formal yet. Although we have had discussions with several financial institutions around what that might look like in the future.
Okay. 2 other quick questions. The first one, and we're going to have plenty of time, by the way. I'm hoping to have enough time for a few audience questions before the administrator gets here. What's the advantage, Mike, of partnering with a training organization and seeing this young person come in and then wind up at United Airlines? Can you give us 2 or 3 advantages of training them from the floor up?
Sure. So the biggest advantage that we see, and I'll use the analogy, when someone comes to see us, we're going to spend 30 minutes with them.
Sure.
And I use the analogy of living in their house. We're going to spend some time in their house for 30 minutes versus I've had a relationship and I've lived with you for 2+ years. So we have a really good idea of who you are 2 years later versus, and we're, I would say, reasonably very good at living with somebody for 30 minutes and figuring out what they're really all about. But that's ultimately the biggest benefit for us, Frank, is insight into the person's ability to fly, to lead, to communicate, and to be a valued member of the team, which is what we're really trying to assess.
Yeah, kind of. That's what we did in the military.
Right.
Floor up.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to switch hats.
Okay.
Right? Okay, now I'm going to have you put your A4A hat on.
Okay.
This personnel shortage doesn't just apply to pilots, does it?
No.
What's going on? No. Talk to us about that.
So I think there's a general consensus within the member carriers of A4A that the pilot challenge, the supply issue, is real and significant. However, at the same time, there is a pending shortage where there are traffic controllers, technicians, dispatchers and certificated personnel.
Sure.
And that while the pilot piece of it is a big component of it, it's a networked solution.
Right.
And we need to take a larger look at a better and a more comprehensive approach to that.
Well, it's a good time to get involved in this industry, isn't it?
That is correct.
You have a license, you have a good chance of getting a pretty good job right now.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mike. That was great. Captain Dave McKenney, we're going to move over to you now. You've spent a lot of time looking at pilot training programs around the world, here, around the world, in North America. So I'd like you to just take a minute and talk a little bit about ab initio programs and how, when we bring a young person in, as we just described with Mike, what are some of the insights that you've developed, that you've picked up? Just talk for a few minutes about what do you think are the characteristics of quality programs and how they might fit into this puzzle.
Okay, thank you, Frank.
And by the way, you have about 3 minutes. No, I'm just kidding, Dave. Just go ahead. But it is a very important question because ab initio umbrellas a lot of these programs that we're going to hear about.
Yeah, so we've said many times up on this stage, many people have done that the best safety feature, the most important safety feature in any airline operation, obviously, is a well-trained, highly motivated, and skilled professional pilot.
Sure.
And so the key is, and the question is, how do we take somebody who, let's say 0 to hero, 0 to being in the right seat, the left seat, how do we actually get them there? And that's kind of what we're talking about with pilot supply, is times are changing. We have a different aircraft up there, more complex aircraft, more complex airspace.
Sure.
And just society has changed. And so how do we motivate somebody to come into our industry? We need to make it attractive. We need to give them career progression. We need to show them that they can sustain that and move on. So once we do that and we can bring them and convince them to come in, the question is, at the beginning of that training, so ab initio, let's talk about ab initio first, because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of different definitions that people use. But ab initio just really means from the beginning. So it's that initial training that the pilot receives to whatever end we describe. So that's why there's different types of ab initio programs, because the pilots actually finish that initial training at certain parts. Some people do it all the way to the right seat, as we do here with an ATP. They bring them into the right seat of one of our 121 aircraft. There's some programs in the world that have ab initios. They graduate with less hours, but they do on-the-job training in the airplane with passengers, which we don't support here in the United States in our regulatory structure. But then they spend time later, 5 or 6 months, for example, upgrading them to captain, where ours may take a month, theirs takes 5 to 6 months, and so forth. So there's a lot of different types. So the question is then, what's in these programs, and how do we actually develop these young people that want to be pilots? And so I went and looked in our Section 85. So for those of you who know what that is, it's our administrative manual, just to pull out a few of our ab initio training programs and mentoring statements looking at the ab initio programs. So we say ALPA supports ab initio training programs that result in the candidate being issued an ATP certificate, because that's how our current regulatory structure is. It results in the candidate being issued not only a rating, but ensures competency to pilot and command standards for safely operating the aircraft in air carrier operations. And this is one of the big things I see as I go around the world, and I do interface with a lot of the different training associations, is with some of the programs, we think that in the United States, our pilots, when they get to the right seat, or the left seat, but the right seat, is that they actually have the skills to be pilot in command. They can make decisions, and some of the programs, we had in 2013, up at ICAO, we had an MPL symposium to look at how the MPL program that was instituted in 2006, how that was going, and some of the issues that were raised were, we were teaching them very good, the fundamentals of flying, the fundamentals of programming using the automated systems, but they were lacking in a lot of the command skills, the airmanship. And it's really the experience. We can teach people to fly airplanes, but how do we teach them the experience once we teach them the basics? And all that has to be done at a very high level and then during that initial part, driven into the pilots. In other words, we allow them to gain the experience on how to use the different tools, the different skills that they've been given, how they apply that knowledge and skills to the actual air operations. If we build that strong core at the beginning, and then we give them opportunities to be flying and see how it progresses, in the future, we could actually, it's easier, cheaper, and it's easier to keep them current in the certain skills. If we cut costs at the beginning, don't give them the good training that they need to build that strong foundation, we find ourselves throughout their whole career, in a lot of cases, to keep trying to rebuild those skills that they should have had at the beginning. And so that's where we think it's very important at the beginning. The airmanship skills, like I said, a lot of times are forgotten about, which again is decision making, how you make command decisions, how you communicate, and how you work with the other pilots, because we're no longer individual pilots out there flying around, we're crews. And as we get more and more automated with our systems, we're working more with our dispatchers real time and other resources that we have, and then how do we bring all those in? The last thing is the actual, I'll just read a couple other things here, some of the things, but it includes a good selection process, but the simulators. Some of the programs, some of the ab initio programs, I'm not saying what they do or don't do, but we need to use airplanes as well as the simulators. The simulators are very good training tools for certain things, as you all know, for abnormals and that, but when you're doing your first initial training, those first couple 200, 300, 500 hours, is time spent in the aircraft, going through the airspace, handling the unknown issues that arise, because again, one of the things that we do is we handle the variability. The pilots, we handle the variability in the system, and we're constantly changing and making changes to our plans. And it's very difficult to put that into the simulator where we have scripted training sessions, and the pilots are used to what they're going to do, what they're going to be tested on, but then you put them out in the real world and they cannot change over or deal with the unknown issues. So that's a very important thing, is why we need to be using a combination of both the simulators and the aircraft for that initial skills. Okay, so I'll just stop there and then we'll go on to your other questions.
Well, thanks, Dave. You mentioned a couple of things that I think are worth reiterating, and I'll just ask you to expand on a little bit. All of these programs are based on quality instructors, well-trained instructors and calibrated instructors. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, because the training, as we said, the training that we get both in the simulator and the aircraft, it comes down to how good the instructors are.
Sure.
And again, we've had that here, several discussions over the years and several panels on that actually, on the instructor training, and we're working at several venues right now around the world trying to develop better instructors. And when we see the movement that we have now, one of the key issues is a lot of our instructors start moving and we start losing, we're trying to train new instructors.
Sure.
So how do we actually train the instructors, what tools they have, and again, with the upset prevention and recovery training, you've seen over the last couple of years that we've actually developed new tools and new training for the instructors. So again, for the ab initio pilot, some of the programs that we had with, I'll say with the multi-pilot license and some of the programs that hopefully we won't see, and I'll talk about, I know one of the ones that Mike's talking about, and they've actually doubled the pay of their instructors to keep them. So they've actually paid their instructors because they don't want to have that turnover. They've actually paid them well, so they make more money than going to the regionals to do that. But
And where was that? Can you give us a website so they can sign their kids up? So,
I said they kept the instructors.
oh, they kept them. Okay. There you go.
But yeah, the instructors is probably one of the key assets to this whole thing, and that will, I still think, be one of our dilemmas as we go through this.
Sure.
Is how do we maintain them? And the other issue that we always have is, okay, well, that's no problem. We can use retired pilots or people in their 60s
Right.
and 70s.
Exactly.
But when you start looking at people in their 60s or 70s and they start training, 20-somethings or 15-year-olds, and I see
Right.
that right now with where I live, is how do we pass on the information that we have,
Right.
but how do we interface with these younger people and how do we communicate? Because we have two different worlds.
Sure. How young people learn is very different as well. And so one of the big issues that we've looked at in all of our pilot trainings, but dialed down into the ab initio training, is what role do you see distant education playing in this? Is there a place for it? Is it overused, underused? Where do you see that? Are we losing that human interface with that instructor you talked about?
Yes, I think that's because again, as instructors, the first thing we did was I started teaching ground school.
Sure.
Okay, so you find your good instructors that teach ground school, and they work into the airplane
Right.
and so forth. But yeah, I think what we've done is when we moved the training, say, to distance learning,
Sure.
we've lost some of that human interface that was so critical to our learning. I'm not saying it's old school, and trust me, in the 80s and 70s, I was already doing computer-based training and designing it.
Sure.
But it's the interactive stuff that needs to be done. In a classroom, we're interactive between the instructor and the students. And many of you, that are doing the distance learning and receiving it know that there's not a lot of interaction. You can't ask questions. So how do you know that you actually understood what was presented to you? Yeah. And with that question and give and take back and forth to the instructors in the classroom. So I think we went too far on the distance learning, and we need to come back where it's, again, it's always a constant pendulum swing, but we need some classroom still and
A blend.
But more interactive. We need to do better on how we do the distance learning.
Sure.
And another thing, especially on major things that we're all going to be training, if every airline's training the same thing, even the manufacturers, because it's so expensive to develop some of this interactive distance learning, I think the industry should be partnering together to develop it, that we all use the same training. So in other words, instead of spending $10,000 to do a very simple module that I give to my airline or my pilots, if it costs $90,000 or $200,000 to do this interactive where they can really do it and really get a lot of good information out of it, is why shouldn't we be partnering and getting different carriers, wherever else, the government, to help build a good course where it's really productive? Because we don't really measure the effectiveness of our training as we should. Again, that instructor in the room, your check airmen, your instructors in the simulator, they're measuring the effectiveness and how those students are doing. But how do we actually measure that with distance learning?
Sure.
And that's one key thing that I think we need to do and get more interactive, so we can actually be measuring if they got the message or not, if they understood it. And if not, then we can do the retraining.
Right. Anecdotally and metrically, I think we're learning that because of some of the new technologies and the new ways that we learn and the new philosophies of learning, which are good, there's a downside to that as well. And I think just one person's opinion, we're starting to sense a little reduction in basic knowledge for our pilots out flying. And I'm not sure exactly what the cause is, but I'm a victim of that as well. I think a little bit more traditional classroom training. I'm not saying go back to the old school, but some more face-to-face is probably a good way to go. Dave, one last question for you. We're doing pretty good on time, but a quick answer to this one. Talk to us about the blend of full motion simulation versus fixed base FTD type training. Do you think we're at the right sweet spot there? Do we need more full motion, less full motion? Where do you think we are in this?
It's a hard question.
You got 30 seconds to
30
answer
seconds
that one.
again?
Yeah, no.
But no, actually, the answer is it depends on the carrier, the operator.
Okay. So it's got to be tailored to the certificate holder.
Yeah, so it always has to be tailored to them. And so the
Sure.
comment I will make would be that we always say that we should be using the appropriate training methodology and the training tool for the knowledge and skill that we're trying to develop.
Happens to be in ALPA's policy. Go ahead.
Okay.
Right device
So
for the right learning
the right
outcome.
device. And so,
Right.
yeah, so as I said, is if you're doing it all, and that's why I said some of the ab initio programs where they're trying to go all simulator, they don't understand the difference between the training that's done in the simulator and the limitations of
Sure.
that training versus what they get in an aircraft. The same thing with a fixed space versus a full motion. Are we using full motions when we should be using fixed spaces? The answer is yes.
Absolutely.
Are we
Goes
using,
both ways.
are we using fixed spaces? We should be using full motion, yes, and so
Sure.
forth with aircraft. So the key there, which is really hard for Mike and his group, I know, and with all the changes, is how do you do that? How many devices do you need?
Sure. They're expensive.
They're expensive, and
Yeah.
how do you schedule all those?
Sure.
So
And when you talk about the actual device, the right device, the correct device for the correct learning outcome, there's something to be said for that first solo out and back, isn't there? When you take that airplane, the actual airplane, and you enter the airspace. It seems simple to us now. Well, you just get on an airplane and you fly it from Colorado Springs to Albuquerque and back. But I think sometimes we all forget how exciting that was when you actually took that airplane and you did it for real in the real airspace, right? And that thrill that you had. So there's the right device, the correct device for the correct learning outcome.
And the other part of that is that's where distance learning is. I think that is also a teaching methodology or a tool.
Right.
And we're using that to teach some of the things that actually have applications that we
Right.
should be applying them, but it's very good for knowledge and a few other applications, but we're taking it further than
Right.
it should.
So I'm going to put an appeal in here to Captain McCasky, who has his A4A hat on. So when you're back and you're figuring out your programs and talking about it, don't forget, remember what it was like to fly that airplane for the first time, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So there's a blend, right?
There is a blend.
There is
Yeah.
certainly a blend, right? It gives you confidence and all that. So we're going to take a unique, thanks, Dave. That was great. Good discussion. We're going to take a unique spin to something. You're probably looking at your venue and you're going, what does UAS's unmanned vehicles have to do with this? Well, we have Pierre visiting from Transport Canada, Pierre Ruel. Thank you for coming. And he's going to talk a little bit about how the pilot supply might be affected by or joined with the pilot supply for unmanned vehicles and how that might all link together here, right? Because after all, we're all going to be operating in the same airspace, and I don't want to give too much away.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was scratching my head a little bit before I came here.
Yeah.
I said, okay.
So was I.
Yeah, but you know, it made me think, and I think we're on the right path here.
We are.
UAS, you know, whether we like them or not, they're part of the aviation now.
Sure.
They're part of our world, and so we have the option to segregate them or integrate them. And if we integrate them properly, it's going to be, we could do something positive. It could be a win-win situation for everybody. And I know for a fact that FAA and Transport Canada, we're looking at it in the same way.
Sure.
At the moment, the regulation is a bit patchwork. And down here you have Part 107.
Right.
You have also waiver processes. In Canada, we have different nomenclature, but it's about the same thing. Our recent regulations just hit Canada Gazette, which is equivalent to your Federal Register.
Right.
So people are going to comment on the rulemaking. So we are getting there. It's taking time. But the takeaway, I think, is when we're going to ask these people to follow the proper regs, to properly demonstrate that they have the knowledge, it'll be very similar to someone learning how to become a private pilot in some cases. Oh, we can kill that slide for
You want me to
now.
kill that?
It's a really busy slide, so...
Yeah, I was just trying to read it.
Yeah, no, I have
There's
built
gonna be a
slides
test.
later if we need them.
Well, yeah, it's there.
But
there you go.
what I was trying to say is, depending which category of flying you're going to fly an unmanned aircraft in, whether it's a limited or rural area, or even more complex area, there'll be different various knowledge requirements for those. Okay, so you're going to have to do either knowledge testing online if it's for the simple categories, or if it's for the most complex, flying over people, flying near aerodromes. You're going to be going through some testing similar to someone doing a commercial license or commercial light equivalent. So knowledge tests, demonstrating your skills and so on. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because the fact that you're pushing people to learn about airspace, weather, airmanship
Sure.
to some extent, all these factors affecting
Crew resource
aviation.
management, all of those pieces.
There will be all these people learning and testing their knowledge, and the numbers are going to be huge. I mean, the market is just exploding. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. They're going to get into this UAV. So if only a small percentage of these people get the hook or get the taste of aviation,
Right.
you know, they say, I really like this airspace things. These weather questions is something I really like.
Right.
They might be the people that would never have thought of setting foot into the local flying club. But because now you're telling them you want to fly your UAV, you need to do some knowledge testing, you force them to learn about airspace and weather in a sense. If only a small percentage of these people decide to make the jump to manned aviation, well, there you go. You have a new avenue of people joining the manned aviation or the big family of aviation.
Right.
Some folks may decide, no, it's not for me. I'd rather be on the ground than fly an unmanned aircraft, but there will be a percentage, I'm sure, that will decide, hey, I really like this. So another venue. The other aspect I was thinking of about how does unmanned aviation affect manned aviation, at some point, and in some areas of aviation, classic aviation, I think we're going to reduce the pressures. It could be for the type of work that helicopters do at the present, survey work,
Yes.
even the ag spraying, who knows,
Sure.
photo, filming, and so on, that's already on the way. So perhaps the unmanned aviation is going to take a small slice of what used to be the classic aviation and reduce a bit of pressure in that sense.
Sure, so some of those folks will become available to the manned aviation.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah.
So let's see, we're trying to figure this out now. We're trying to see how the unmanned development can actually affect the manned element, the manned supply. That's very interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to build a little story and ask you a question. So I'm a young man, which I'm not, but if I was, and I'm flying, let's say I'm flying UAVs in British Columbia, and I'm working for a company, and I'm doing forestry surveilling, okay? And I get that itch that you just talked about, right? Because he went flying, and he went flying with a friend or a buddy, and he says, you know, I'm interested in this manned flying thing. So I'm going to put our regulator on the spot here. We just said that he's going to be certified or at least have some background in charting, airmanship, threat and error management, weather, airspace, all of those things. Do you think any of that from a regulatory perspective could transfer over potentially to a manned license at some point? And is Transport Canada looking at that?
I do, Frank. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
And we gotta, like I said, we gotta integrate this new sector, this new community
The
into
family of aviators.
our what used to be the classic aviation club,
Sure.
and bring them inside, and so that we can all work together to make sure that the airspace is safe. But at the same time, if they spend the time and effort to learn about airspace, weather, and develop airmanship at the same time, I think it'd be foolish not to give them the credits for that to some extent.
To some extent,
Yeah.
certainly.
So we're not there yet because, like I said, most countries are still, we're trying to catch up to technology
Absolutely.
with our regulations, but it's something we definitely should look at in the future.
in the partnering of aviation, family of aviation. Captain McCasky, I'll put you on the spot a little bit before we open it up. So you're looking at a resume, or the people that work for you are looking at a resume. How do you think you'd view UAV time? You know what I mean? I mean, the United States Air Force is obviously moving very dramatically on this. We go to the same flight screening before we can go to UAV training or manned. Have you thought about that at all?
We have. At this point in time, we don't give any credit in our
Okay.
application and hiring process for remotely piloted vehicles or
Right.
helicopters.
Or helicopters?
Or helicopters. That goes towards the total time, but the specific
Total time, right.
type rating time,
Sure.
we don't give credit for that.
But you never know.
We never know. I mean, I think to Pierre's comment, we'd have to look at the certification and the regulatory environment.
Right.
And as long as it was regulatorily feasible,
Sure.
I'm not sure why we
You'd look
wouldn't
at it.
consider it.
Yeah. Paul, you're out on the road, right? You're looking at talking to young people at various aviation schools. Do they talk about UAVs at all?
Sure. A lot of the programs now that have piloted manned programs are also developing
There you go.
unmanned programs,
Yeah.
and it's a competing factor. And so one of the
great.
things that's challenging for a young man or woman who's making their decisions is, you know, when they're looking at a career, what's that career look like, and what are the pathways? And right now, the UAS, the large UAS opportunities, are competitive. They're very competitive. And so I think it's something we have to be aware of.
Right.
But I think there's an important discussion that should be had at how you maybe transition from
Right.
one to the other.
Absolutely. The family of aviators, as Pierre described. Dave, have we looked at all at UAV training at ALPA? Should we do that, you think?
Yeah, as far as I know, we haven't.
I mean, the actual hands-on pilot training. I know we're spending a lot of effort on UAV in
Right.
terms of airspace and all that. And we are doing some with pilot training, but from a specific pilot training world, put your training hat on. Should we spend more resources and time looking at the training of UAVs, UAV pilots?
I honestly, we haven't looked at it. And
Yeah, maybe we
I've
should.
been in the HF world, and I've been looking at some of how they do their training.
Sure.
And even though we have a lot of things in common. Their workstations and a lot of that are completely different.
There you go.
And it's more controller. I mean, it's more like an air traffic controller screen. And what we get in our flight decks, if you haven't seen their workstations, a lot of our stuff is consolidated, and we have it on one primary flight display or right on our flight deck. And they'll have 4 or 5 different screens, and they're the ones who have to consolidate all the information to figure out what it is. And so it's completely different. And one of the things that did strike me when I saw the first ones was, like on our primary flight displays, we're going, nose up, we're following the aircraft.
Right.
And theirs is a controller screen, so, it's not, it's just going in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And it's just like, so you have to figure out where it is. If you got to turn, you got to figure out, okay, where it is, how's it going to turn? If it's here, we know we're going to go left or go right.
Right.
Because we're on the Magenta line. So, but again, they have a lot of different ways of training it, but it might be, we might be able to gain something from it.
Absolutely. So. Pierre, a question for you. So, are you guys, are the regulators in Canada considering a different level of certification for somebody who is flying a UAV recreationally or maybe out in Western Canada, or someone that would then be certified maybe to do real estate work over Toronto? Big difference in the airspace, let's face it.
Yeah,
you want me to
we
put the chart
perhaps,
back up?
Yeah, if
real
we can
quick?
go to one of the slides, the build.
Yeah.
If you're able to advance that a bit.
I'm pointing. I don't know.
If not.
Here we go. Application
Well,
unavailable.
that was
There you
good.
go.
Good.
There you go.
Worked out well.
I'm a new guy. There we go again.
What can I tell you?
Don't,
Oh, here we go.
yeah.
Keep your
If you
day
can
job.
hit one more, you'll
One
see
more,
FAA
one more,
pop
one more.
up. No, okay, keep going.
One more. I don't know. I'm pointing. I'm clicking. Anyway. Sorry.
Okay, one more. No, okay,
No.
go back one then.
Okay.
Okay. So this is, it's not the whole regulation.
Sure.
It's just a part of the matrix. But the way we're going to do it is, because it's all risk-based regulations. And the
absolutely.
FAA has the same approach, by the way,
Yep.
to some extent. So we go with weight categories first.
Sure.
And it's all up to 25 kilos for now, visual line of sight, VLOS. And then we make, in those cases, we make different categories. Okay, so below 250 grams, we're not going to regulate. From 250 to 1 kilo, we're going to call this the very small category.
Okay.
And above 1 kilo, now you can start having very heavy machines, right?
Sure.
You can have things as heavy as this chair flying
Absolutely.
up in the air. So
Yep.
we're going to break it down into limited or rural environment or
Right.
complex.
Okay.
And complex, we're taking a bit of a leap of faith here.
Right.
Because now the complex environment, like I said, you can have a machine as heavy as this chair flying over downtown Montreal for
Right.
the film industry,
Absolutely.
carrying a $20,000 Hasselblad on it. But it's flying over downtown Montreal, so there's probably people on the ground. So,
Right.
so for that category, we're going to have a very stringent knowledge test for the pilot, like the commercial kind of license.
Sure.
But it's not just about the pilot, it's also about the machine.
Uh-huh.
I've had discussions with DGI's number 2 there, and I'm telling them this is where we're going, and get ready, because Canada's going there, and who knows what FAA is going to do, but perhaps something very similar. So we're going to ask these manufacturers to meet a certain standard. So whether it's an international standard or a national standard, but it could be something like ASTM down in California.
Sure.
I mean, when you think about it, these light bulbs here above our head meet a standard, whether it's UL or CSA,
Sure.
or whatever it is. So these machines are going to be flying in close proximity to the public or over people.
Absolutely.
Or in controlled airspace to some extent. They need to meet a certain
We'll be
standard.
sharing our airspace
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, so it's
a great
about
point.
the pilot, but it's also the machine. Those are the two main components. You take in higher risk, then we're asking more about your qualifications.
Want to thank the panel. It's always hard to be the last panel. Big
Frank.
crowd.
Great crowd. Frank,
Thanks
thank
very
you so
much.
much for stepping up
Thank
to this
you
panel,
all,
and to all our
Mike.
panelists. Thank you.
Dave, Pierre, thanks very much.